Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure today to introduce three of our students who are in graduate school. They're going to be doing their presentation. So I'll introduce them really quickly because they each only have about 12 minutes. It's kind of tight for time. So our first is Jeff Scott. He did his BSc in biology at the University of Texas and then worked as a fisheries observer for 6 years, which is pretty cool. And he's now doing a master's with Dr. Mimi Lamb and Dr. Lynn Pitcher here, and he's looking at the values of fishing communities. So please welcome Jeff Scott.
So, research here at the Fisheries Center can generally be classified as being either descriptive or normative. That is either basic science, such as stock assessments and system modeling, or it can be applied science, such as policy recommendations, and conservation science, which fall into the normative category. Now, one issue with normative products is that they rely upon some ethical assumptions that aren't always made explicit in theory, and then offer some ideas about how it can be applied to better inform decision-making in the fisheries management. We're going to begin with a brief discussion of normative ethics. This is the classic tradition of what people should do. It all kind of begins with Aristotle some 2,400 years ago. He posited this idea of virtue ethics, by which warriors in battle should instill these virtues within themselves: prudence, temperance, courage, and justice, in order to be more ethical people. You know, of course, the whole warrior ethic thing is a little bit dated. There have been a number of modern revisions of virtue ethics that make a little bit more sense for our current values and norms. A couple of millennia after Aristotle came Immanuel Kant, who offered a deontological or rule-based system of ethics called that he fashioned on moral imperative. This is a rule-based system that says that people following certain moral laws or rules will always be moral. There are issues with this, such as what happens when rules contradict each other. His classic example is what to do if a murderer asks you where he can find his prospective victim. According to Kant, you would be in the wrong if you lied to protect the victim. That's the virtue of truth trumps everything. This obviously doesn't sit well with common moral sense. An alternative was proposed a little while later by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. The idea of utilitarianism is that the ends always justify the means, and that something is good when it produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. This has been a highly influential theory in the field of economics. However, it also has issues of its own, such as what to define good as and how to distribute good equitably amongst a number of people. And all of these theories ultimately rest upon even deeper assumptions of what moral good is. Around with meta-ethics, philosophers wonder if morality is something that we can logically infer through reason, or if it's something that has to come through the gut, what we call intuitionism. Another idea is whether it derives from a single foundation, whether you call monism, or whether there are multiple sources or foundations of morality, pluralism. Now, these are all very relevant questions. However, as a scientist, I'm a little bit more interested in how people actually feel and what values they actually hold, which brings me to a more recent field of descriptive ethics. This is a very highly interdisciplinary field, full of philosophers as well as social psychologists and behavioral economists and anthropologists. It's less concerned with what people should do to be moral, but what actual moral values they hold. My favorite thing to have come out of this field is the moral foundations theory. It has been developed by Jonathan Haidt and Jesse Graham over the last couple of decades. And they attempt to unify all of morality across cultures under 5 or 6 universal foundations. They fall into the foundations of welfare and justice, loyalty or group solidarity, deference to authority, and abhorrence of impurity, or sake or degradation foundation. They also posit a potential sixth category of self-sovereignty, liberty or repression. Now, these can be grouped into more individualistic foundations, where the welfare and justice benefit individuals more than groups, and then the group foundations of loyalty and authority difference and whatnot. Now, the archetypical experiments looking at this have been done in America with political ideology. Here we can see that American self-described extreme liberals tend to value the foundations of welfare and fairness much more highly than they do the foundations of loyalty, authority, and safety. That is, they value the individual foundations much more. The converse is true for extremely conservatives, in which they hold much more value to the group, towards the group foundations than the liberals. Now, all of this plurality is accepted and tolerated in a liberal society such as Canada's. However, it can lead to some very difficult situations when trying to come up with solutions to tough problems. And this is where we have to ask if ethics can offer any sort of practical solution or if it's just a bunch of theory. One tool that's been developed by practical or applied ethics is the ethical matrix. Essentially a framework in which certain principles are elucidated, stakeholders are defined, and then the impacts upon these stakeholders are evaluated for a variety of scenarios in respect to these principles that have already been established. Now, Mimi Lam, who at the Fisheries Center, along with a couple of European colleagues, have attempted to apply this ethical matrix and adapted for the BC herring fishery. They hope to use this in a workshop of Haida fishermen and resource managers to first identify traditional Haida values and then allow the participants to evaluate the impacts of a variety of management scenarios in respect to the traditional ethics that they hold. What I'm interested in doing is building upon this to look at both the value of herring to the Haida as well as to commercial fishermen, and look at how these values influence different attitudes towards the resource management, and whether there's any solution to the current conflict between the First Nations and the commercial industry. The take-home message I'd like to give you from theoretical ethics is that at the end of the day, we as fisheries experts are nothing more than people that are very knowledgeable about fisheries. We have no moral superiority over anyone else. And at the end of the day, what I feel is most important is that any ethical fisheries management decision is rooted in the values of all stakeholders and not just the supposed experts.
Questions?
Jeff, one thing that worries me about the theory is that a group like ISIS would score very highly on all those 6 attributes that you outlined. And there's something wrong with that, right?
I'm not so sure that they would score highly on the more individualistic ones at all. What they would do. And that's another interesting thing. It's very tempting to treat descriptive ethical theory, such as moral foundations theory, as being normative. But there is no sort of normative. The people that have proposed moral foundations theory are not saying that these moral foundations should be equally valued. They are saying that different cultures value them differently. It is up to people in society to determine whether certain values are more important than others. And in ISIS's society, they have decided through the rule of law that these group solidarity morals are much more important than individual welfare or liberty. I think that ultimately that is something that is not necessary in these days.
but in a field like fisheries, which is very much rooted in positive science and actually very utilitarian at the outset, how do you reconcile those two? Like, how do you, like, what if a group wants to fish something out because that's their ethic, but that goes against the rules that have been created in the country or by the rest of society? How do you reconcile those?
Well, I think that in such a case, if no one else speaks up, then if a society at large decides that it's not important enough for them to step in, then I believe that the people that are involved have every ethical right to do what they're doing. I think that it is a decision on the part of people that find resource management valuable and ethical to make themselves be heard and be part of the conversation and argue that their ethics and their standpoints are more legitimate than the others.
That's one more question.
I'm kind of interested in how, I was recently at a workshop with both DFO scientists and DFO managers, and there was kind of this conflict about being able to define an objective that was mutually reasonable because scientists were interested in being sort of objective and, I guess, descriptive, whereas managers have more of a normative perspective. And I'm wondering about kind of your insight into how individuals in the same organization can work together if they're sort of taking like different ethical approaches.
I think the first step to anything is to make explicit what people's assumptions are. I think too often people talk past each other because these ethical foundations that people have are not recognized as legitimate. Recognizing that people from different backgrounds do have different incentives and different values is a good starting point. I think it's also important to remember that managers and scientists have interests of their own, and that it's not simply a beautiful sort of altruistic debate going on. I think making very explicit values versus interests, I think is the first place to start.
Thank you very much, Scott. Our next contestant is Darah Gibson, and she is currently a master's student with the Fisheries Economics Research Unit. And before that, she got her BSc in environmental biology and ecology at UBC. And then she worked with the Ceramics project here for a while, specializing in North Sea fisheries. And now she's doing economic valuations of British Columbia fisheries. So please get up for Darah.
So my work is going to be part of Ocean Canada, which is a project here at UBC and all over Canada, led by Rashid. It consists of members from different universities, DFO, and plenty of NGOs like Living Ocean Society. So the goal of the project is to link all three of Canada's oceans as social ecological systems, focusing on small coastal communities. And my work will be part of the National Data and Integrated Scenarios paper. So my main research questions are how can we make a nationwide definition for small and large scale fisheries, which can be applied to BC and then hopefully elsewhere. And which of these fisheries will fit best with Canada's sustainability goals for the future? And these goals are yet to be defined by the project. And finally, which fisheries and communities in BC will be most vulnerable and resilient to a changing climate and policy change? So small-scale fisheries have been kind of shoved down everyone's throats recently as being important. And why are they important? Well, 90% of the world's fishers work in small-scale fisheries, providing 25% of the global catch. This proportion can be even higher in developing countries and maybe lower in a developed country such as Canada. So some common definitions for small-scale fisheries are vessels under 12 meters, vessels without a motor, multi-gear, multi-species, and majority of the catch going towards human consumption, not reduction purposes. So from these definitions that are commonly used in the literature, you can see that they don't really apply to Canada. It's not too often you see a non-motorized vessel under 12 meters. So part of the challenge to define small-scale fisheries for Canada is that smallness is a relative term. So my methods have been created here at UBC and used in the past by Daniel and Ravi. And I'm going to group the commercial fisheries based on a target, year, and the length of the vessel, take the landed catch in tons and rank them, then assign a monetary value and create a cumulative percentage distribution. And from there, all fisheries falling below 50% of this distribution will be considered small scale. So here's an example figure. This is not my data or DFO data of what this would look like. So splitting at 50% and everything below is small scale. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about fisheries in BC for those who are not familiar. So in Canada in 2013, $2.2 billion in landed value were caught. Around 250 million of that was from BC. So clearly BC is the smaller fishery in Canada. And so these are a few of the commercially important species. We have salmon up here, which if you were to ask basically anybody in the city, what is the most important species and most important fishery in Canada or in BC, they would probably say salmon, even though it's not the most economically valuable species. And Dungeness crab is another important species and is often paired with salmon, so a lot of people will fish them at different times. And here we have sablefish, which is an interesting fishery because it's quite small, and it used to be kind of more of a garbage fish. It wasn't really considered edible. And recently, or in the last maybe 30 years, has become a really high value species. And it's actually interesting because this fish may fall into large scale just because it is a small fishery, but it's such a high value with that distribution that I'm using. A valuable species like this may fall into large when it is in fact small because it's commonly caught with pots and traps, as well as some longline. And then on the bottom we have Pacific halibut, which in 2013 represented 17% of the landed value in BC, so very lucrative fishery. So this is, these are some images from where I'm from, Ladner, which is just south of Vancouver, and it's historically a farming and fishing village, and now it is not so much a fishing village, but more a farming town. So this photo on the left was taken in the 1980s, and this is actually my grandfather's boat and his brother's boat. And then behind you can see the quality is not great, but some smaller vessels, and then maybe a large one there with a big drum. And then on the right-hand side of the screen, these are two images of Ladner today with larger, more modern vessels. So just in my lifetime, my observations, Ladner's gone from a community where kind of everyone knew a fisherman. It's kind of held the community together. And my grandfather and all his friends were fishermen. My mom worked on his boat in the summers, and that just isn't the case today. I think there's only one girl from my high school that still goes out with her dad, but she's not going to enter the fishery. So there's been a large social shift in Ladner, and we're fortunate enough that we're close to the city. I'm here at the university doing something different. This isn't the case for small communities in BC like Fort Hardy or Prince Rupert or Kitimat, where their community depends on the commercial fisheries. So another point I wanted to make is when I originally looked at these photos, I noticed that today these small vessels are missing. There aren't as many. And originally my thought was there's fewer smaller vessels and more larger, more modern vessels. But when I looked at the DFO data, you can see that there aren't any more larger vessels. In fact, there's fewer. But in the past 30 years, there has been such a major decline in the smaller vessels. So the proportion of small to large has decreased. So the next steps that I'm going to take are interviewing some fishers in Ladner to get their opinions of what they consider small and large and somehow incorporate that into my work. And then I will be choosing a series of indicators such as number of people employed in the fishery, ecological damage, fuel consumption, and how much of the catch goes towards human consumption versus industrial purposes, and then projecting those indicators on short, medium, and long-term scales to see which fisheries and which of these communities that depend on these fisheries will kind of win or lose in the future. And that is all. I'd just like to acknowledge Ocean Canada, Rashid, and Peru. So any questions or comments? Yes?
Thanks, Darah. That's a great talk. I really like your project, but I'm totally confused about this idea of putting a 50% line and saying the half above is large scale and half below is small scale. Like it seems arbitrary at best and maybe even dangerous at worst. Like, why does it need to be a 50-50 split, and why is that your criteria?
It's just been a method used, so we are exploring different options. This is just what I had.
Right.
On the Atlantic coast, they do have a definition of inshore fleet, which is everything below 65 feet.
Right.
So we may split that way using the Atlantic's kind of definition because there isn't one for the Pacific. It's something that's still a little bit up in the air. I do agree that it's not the best method, but it is one that has been used in the literature.
I've got a related question. You're ordering things by value of the catch, but of course you could rank them by just the gross tonnage of the catch, and you get a rather different split, whatever the criterion is. Or you could rank them by vessel size, which is what a lot of countries do.
Yeah.
So it might be quite interesting to explore those different alternative ways of ranking them and coming up with your split point.
And that's why I was hoping to do some interviews and kind of incorporate what the fishers see as an important kind of definition.
Because a lot of people have ideas about the attributes of small-scale fisheries, which the social scientists can give you a long list of these things, an owner, driver, all that kind of thing, small-scale gear and less damaging gear, and well, not always, but so that it'd be quite neat to look at which ranking system was most closely aligned with those social science views of small-scale fisheries.
In connection with this, FAO doesn't distinguish between large scale and small scale. And Tony Charles and I recently wrote a letter to Science suggesting that FAO should do that.
Yeah.
Now the issue is the editor wanted us to provide a definition for small scale and large scale. And we pointed out that if we gave such definition, or we said there should be a definition, then the project to separate into large scale and small scale would never happen, because the different countries have different definitions. But if the countries using different definition were to supply, based on their definition, the split, you would still have the world catch of small scale and large scale, except that the world catch would be based on shifting definition. And I wonder, philosophically, if this is correct or not, but practically, you cannot have an agreement on a definition that would be a consensual, worldwide and even nationally. You cannot have it. So they must be like models, like any model, they must be used for the practicality. And the practicality of your definition it's one that this paper was produced, I'm a co-author of it, the first. We explored that in 2000, and I concluded for my part that I would not follow up on this, because when we say 50%, when we use for volume or value, we end up always having 50% of small scale and large scale. So you cannot actually represent the changing relationship over time, because you always have 50%. So that's is a principled argument that would work against that definition.
I agree.
Yeah.
There's a big discussion about the, I mean, you could have more threshold, you could have the quartile, so you could say upper and lower quartile, upper would definitely be large scale, lower quartile definitely small scale, and then in the middle is some middle stuff that doesn't have.
Yeah, there's talk
You could do all
before
sorts of
about
things like that.
these medium scale fisheries, but I mean, it's not that clear using this vessel data.
Interesting discussion.
One more question for Darah.
Sorry, I'm just wondering what the value for perhaps policy and management in BC of having that definition would be, like having that hard class definition, whether it's for BC or for the nation.
Yeah, I think it would be useful. I mean, they use the definition on the Atlantic. They put a lot of focus on using short, smaller vessels as a way of, I think they have to be owner-operators or something like that. So it's a way of distributing the value of the fishery better on the Atlantic coast, and that's not in place here. So I'm hoping that maybe we can find a way to incorporate this. That's it.
Okay, last but not least, got Ravi here with us. Ravi did his BSc at the University of the West Indies in marine biology, and then completed a professional master's at the University of Miami in fisheries science. And he is now in the second year of his PhD, working on coral reef fisheries management. So let's give it a big hand.
Exciting to be here. Thanks for coming on, guys. So, Andreas was saying I'm working on coral reef fisheries. So coral reefs are very much considered to be rainforests of the ocean, and that's owing to their incredible structural complexity that hosts a wide, a diverse species assemblage of many marine organisms. Unfortunately, coral reefs have been undergoing significant declines over the past few decades. In the Great Barrier Reef, 50% decline in coral cover was observed between the period of 1985 to 2012. And the Caribbean, even worse off, approximately 80% decline between 1977 and 2002. What that looks like, kind of like this. You see, in 1975, there's a picture of Discovery Bay in Jamaica. You see these massive acropora, beautiful acropora beds, black and white. But when you see these in color, they're really nice. And that's same exact picture, same exact reef in 2013, completely decimated. And this is a Carries Fort reef in the Florida Keys. You can see it's a similar case with the Parramatta beds up there. So massive declines in coral cover. And this is primarily because of a number of external stresses that have been acting on these ecosystems for quite some time. Primarily human impacts and climate impacts. So human impacts have been acting on these systems for a very long time. Overfishing and coastal intervention, there's some broad categories of these impacts. Ben Halpern and his co-researchers, they produced the global map of human impacts on marine ecosystems, and coral reefs ranked as one of the highest impacted, despite their small spatial footprint. Climate impacts, these days we're seeing the impact of coral bleaching. It's quite significant. There were the global bleaching events of 98 and then 2005. And the future impacts of acidification and sea level rise that are supposed to threaten reefs well into the future. And so the importance of this, coral reefs are ecologically important, primarily well, in the context of fisheries. They're part of a coastal seascape, this mangrove seagrass coral reef complex that is important for ontogenic migrations of commercially important reef species. So the mangroves provide important juvenile habitat, and as these fish species mature, they slowly migrate offshore through seagrass beds and then finally onto the reef system. And this has importance for society because well, if you look at this map, this map shows the association between coral reef systems in red and countries with low, countries ranked by their GDP. And you can see most of these coral reef systems associated with countries that have quite low GDP. Those are the lighter shaded countries. Many of these countries rely on coral reef systems for numerous ecosystem services, either for nutrition or they rely on income from tourism or fresh fish exports. So potential for societal impacts into the future. Now, these declines have been occurring despite management regimes that have been on these reefs for quite some time. Bellwood defines coral reef management as quite a mouthful. I kind of just summarize some of the key points that they should consider social and ecological goals. And some of the greatest criticisms of many management regimes on coral reefs is that they don't necessarily, especially at is that they don't necessarily consider some of these greater goals and these objectives, these paradigms. And there are significant gaps regarding these particular paradigms. I'm really interested in those ecological gaps, so this is what I'm going to get into now. Like I said, this coral reef ecosystem, it's impacted by multiple stresses, but these stresses, they don't act individually, they act in concert with each other, so they can act, they can have multiplicative effects, they can have additive effects, so it's a very complex, how should I say, mishmash of stresses that are acting on these ecosystems, and it's important to understand that because these systems are quite complex, as I pointed out earlier. There are numerous pathways through which these stresses can influence flows, like energetic flows through the ecosystem, and as a result have impacts such as regime shifts, trophic cascades, and they're quite unpredictable. They're hard to predict if you don't truly understand the underlying ecological complexity. So how do managers deal with this? How do researchers deal with this? While there's an extensive literature on these external stressors on numerous ecosystem components, many of these stressors are very situational and they have unique spatial context. So how do you distill these stressors into the most relevant ones for the particular case that you study? Many authors have been looking at ecosystem resilience as a framework to sort of pull together the most important stressors and ecosystem components for particular unique spatial contexts. And resilience, once again, another mouthful, defined by Hughes is the capacity of an ecosystem to absorb recurrent disturbances without switching to alternative stable states. And this is important because each ecosystem, like I said, is impacted by its particular stressor, and if you, and has particular cornerstones of resilience as defined by being strong. And these cornerstones of resilience, if you put this together with the idea of sorry, I just need to kind of gather myself. So these two definitions, these two things are very important to my research because they sort of drive the way in which I'm hoping to operationalize this sort of disparate idea of resilience, because there are there are a number of resilience frameworks that are utilized in the literature to bring these different stresses together, and I'm hoping to sort of utilize a couple of them, or maybe one of them to work on a couple of systems in the Caribbean marine system. So focusing on my research, I'm really hoping to find some indicators of coral reef resilience that are simple enough to utilize for management. They're not too complex. They utilize readily available metadata that can be compiled quite easily without a ton of specialized technical know-how. And so my first step is to define my framework, my resilience framework. And within this, I have three particular questions that I would like to identify what the cornerstones of resilience in these Caribbean reef ecosystems are. what particular external forces are important to these reef ecosystems, and how to compartmentalize and quantify these interactions. Secondly, I would like to make some projections into the future to try and understand how these interactions will change in the future under a changing global ecosystem as of climate change and changing human impacts, and what implications they have for society and governance. So, how I plan, well, I'll get into how I plan to approach it, but let me speak a little bit about my current work. So I've been involved in quite a bit of framework building. I've been looking for important cornerstones of resilience, and I've identified a couple. Right now I'm looking at community dynamics of fish and coral species, but primarily fish species right now. I've been looking at ocean warming as a primary stressor on fish dynamics, and I'm looking at to compartmentalize and quantify these dynamics. I'm looking at functional groups, which are these general classifications of species that perform similar ecological roles within an ecosystem. And aspects of that I used to quantify these groups: species richness and response diversity. Response diversity just refers to the, how should I say, if I should just report myself, the diversity of responses that different species show to external stressors on these functional groups. The more diverse these response, the more resilient your function. Right now, I'm working with an indicator that William Leonton, my supervisor. It's a mean temperature of the catch, and what it is, it gives an indication of how species composition changes under global warming, and it's given by the average weighted thermal optimum for all species in the catch report. Now, William did this on a global scale, and I'm hoping to take it and bring it down to regional and national scale. My regional analysis is currently restricted to this particular output, in which I have mean temperature of the catch, the regional average, and sea surface temperature. And you can see that mean temperature of the catches, it follows a similar increasing trend to sea surface temperature, which is what we expect as species that are not thermally adapted to increasing global temperatures will be excluded from the catch. So I'm going to break this down further into EEZs and hopefully functional groups to try and get a better idea of how this might be affecting reef species in particular. Possible future work, and it's a bit of a mess, but under the cornerstones, I'm looking to explore fish community dynamics a bit more with EW, with Ravi and Gibson. I'm hoping to, I'm looking to see how we can apply Williams' dynamic bioclimates on the model to understand how coral species biogeography will change into the future. With respect to external drivers, I'm looking at a signal to noise ratio analysis that looks at synchrony between various external drivers. And with respect to significance, I'm hoping to incorporate some bioeconomic analysis and some policy analysis as well. That concludes my talk. I'd like to acknowledge my committee members, landmates, and the rest of the Fisheries Center. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Questions?
If there are no questions, I would like to make a point about the tree presentation. All three that are presented here are graduate of the FISH500, right? And you have noticed that they use black and white letters that you can read. Not too much stuff on each slide, and so on. There was only one typo in the three things. It's only a symbol that should have been capitalized.
You missed one, Daniel. You missed one typo.
I missed one. There's one more?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. So we should eradicate the typos, but we should because I have not seen them. This is the reason, but we should work toward making presentation that people can see, and people don't fight with reading and stuff. And there is no attempt here to have background and all kinds of stuff, but you can read it. So the FISH500, that's what they learn. I wanted to say that. It's not by accident that these three things are very similar. Yeah.
I have a question for Ravi. Really good presentation. I found like the image you put very powerful when you have like the human impacts, the overfishing, all this stuff, and the climate impacts. Right. So especially in coral reefs, and I guess in Caribbean in particular, the two are working at the same time, at different scales, on the same thing. So like moving forward, like aside from the model, once the models are done, I'm assuming you'll eventually try and go to management or something like that. Like how do you combat those two things? Like some things that you can change and others that you probably won't be able to.
Well, it's quite interesting because some of the literature that I've read has tried to address this problem. And in fact, one of the papers I've read talk about this global disparity in benefits to coral reefs from like reducing global emissions, and actually Caribbean coral reefs would seem to benefit a lot less. And a lot of these authors seem to recommend that instead of thinking about how we could reduce global emissions for the sake of coral reefs, by all means reduce global emissions, but to manage Caribbean coral reefs in particular, we should focus on local drivers, so human impacts like overfishing, coastal development, just things like that that are more local, that have more of a direct impact on the ecosystem as opposed to long-term. So, yeah, so prioritization of those.
Just on the same line, so you're saying that you're planning to use fish community structure and mean temperature cap, but then in a short time frame, isn't fish community structure going to be more impacted by fishing and overfishing than climate change? And so how are you going to account for that, or is that something you're taking into consideration as well?
Oh no, that's certainly something I would like to consider as well. Well, that I have to consider as well too. Fishing is going to be part of that, and I guess that's where I'm going to bring in some of these simulations with EcoBath and EcoCity. But I haven't really gotten to that stages yet. The data exists for me to make that happen and to look at different policy options and how they might influence fish community structure. Because one thing I'm realizing, fish community structure and composition of species that exist on the assemblages, they have an impact on the overall resilience of the ecosystem. So if you manage for those functional groups that actually can contribute to the resilience, well then, you could just go in a sense.
You have time for one more quick question. Well, please join me in giving all three of them a hand.